the name of Allah, the most gracious and most merciful, peace be upon you, ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues. I welcome you in this press conference, the virtual press conference, with the We are gathered this evening as the world is living exceptional circumstances because of this epidemic, as the government of the custodian to the Holy Most continuous efforts and all the government entities has been working to ensure the safety of the public through the announcements of number of initiatives and a surplus package for the private sector. And in this regard, the minister will talk about some of the economical reforms as we are faced with those challenges. Thank you, and peace be upon you, and welcome all. And even though we are communicating remotely, I wanted today to talk about some of the economical reforms in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, starting from praise to Allah, all the preparations that has been undertaken by the government of the custodian of two holy mosques, led by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the director of the Economical Affairs Committee. As in the past few years, the kingdom had been always in a position of preparation as we face those challenges. I'll review some of the facts and what had been taking place from the end of the past year to the beginning of this year, and I'll also talk about what has been undertaken by the steps taken by the government in preparation to combat this epidemic and to deal with it, and also talk about the role of the kingdom, leadership role of the kingdom as leading the G20, and it would also talk about what the government currently is conducting as far as the research, as we are trying to return back to our normal status pertaining to the economy. In the beginning, 2019, by the end of the fiscal year 2019, the government had reached to very advanced levels to implement the plans under the vision of the Kingdom 2030, and it has continued very strict financial measures and to try to combat the deficits in the budget. And also, it has achieved all its goals to increase the non-oil revenues. It had reached 13% by the end of the year, and simultaneously, this was part of a very healthy economical atmosphere that increased the GDP with a high percentage that we didn't see in the past 5 years. The non-oil GDP has increased by means that we didn't see in the previous years, and has been the highest rate of increase for the private sector in the past year and even in the past 5 years. Those efforts was the result of the work and planning that was undertaken for the past 4 or 5 years by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, and continuous work by all the government entities that had helped to achieve those goals. Those efforts has been crowned by having the kingdom reach a very good phase. We have good reserves now. We have reserves of hard currency. We rank third in the world. That has enabled the government to combat this epidemic from a position of strength. Praise to Allah. In the beginning of this epidemic and this crisis, the royal decree from the custodian of Tullah Mosque, based on the recommendation by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, to form a number of teams to deal with this crisis. as far as the security and the political committee's efforts, and also working in accordance with the health committees. A number of resolutions has been announced to protect the public, as this is the first priority of the government and the custodians of the Holy Mosque. It's not only the citizens that are the priority, but that has included the expatriates and the citizens altogether, and has been ordered by the custodian of the Holy Mosque to provide free health care for all present here in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It has been our habit, and this is assured under the current circumstances as we are facing this epidemic. Talking about the economy and the financial sector, a committee has been formed by the Crown Prince and includes a number of ministers to deal with this crisis. Dealing with this crisis need to deal with a number of accesses, but it depends of taking the necessary precautionary measures and to provide the proper financing for the health sector to ensure that all that are working in the health sector have the proper protection, the budget, and the financial means to protect themselves and to deal with the current health crisis. Very huge amounts of money have been provided to the health sector, and also the other part, we have approved a number of stimulus package to mitigate the effects on the economy and the private sector that was mostly affected by this crisis. And the focus was mainly when we look at the steps and the measures taken by the government, what are the different sectors that were greatly affected by this epidemic, and whether those sectors are employing citizens that need to keep their jobs and to deal with the current crisis to maintain their employment. That was a very important point, and that is very important. So when we come back to practice our economical activities to be ready, the third part after the measures and the approvals when were taken, we are talking whether the initiatives that was adapted are implemented as planned for, or are we just dealing with challenges and that we haven't planned for. Of course, we are monitoring closely this epidemic, and we haven't seen such a crisis before, a health crisis before. And as we are learning from each other on a global level, whether the measures undertaken in the health sector or the economical sector and its impact on the different sectors to benefit from it in our internal experiences and to improve our economical experiences. And then we continue in this cycle, and the committee is meeting almost on daily basis. The task force are meeting almost daily. We are monitoring the daily news about this health crisis. Those teams also include very specialized teams as far as what the opportunities that the economy might benefit from in this crisis, whether on the long or midterm or even in the short term, and to ensure that the supply chains, as far as the abundance of the food supply, and we have seen that evident, and not only internally, but even the decisions that were taken by the government was very wise to ensure the availability of the food supply and to provide the necessary support for the private sector and the SMEs specifically. I will try to review of what has been adopted as far as the measures by the government, what has been announced in the past few weeks, very huge number of initiatives and economic stimuluses through the monetary agency to provide money amounts that reach more than 50 billion riyals, especially to support the SMEs, and those are the establishments that employ the Saudi citizen, as we are keen to ensure the continuity of those small businesses, small and medium businesses, and help them to deal with the effects of this crisis. The citizen is the first priority. The employee with the private sector is always our great concern. So therefore, after the initiatives that were undertaken, the monetary agency has provided the SANID initiatives, as some systems have been amended within 48 hours. Normally, systems need a very long time to be amended, but given the current circumstances, the custodial two holdings have ordered to amend the system within 48 hours, and that did happen, and to provide coverage for a huge number of citizens that work in the private sector, as we continue to support the different agencies and the uh, social investment agencies, and the government had decided to pay up to 60% of the employee salaries in the private sector, and also it has worked with the different monetary agencies so that the banks will not deduct the loan payments, so that will not have a negative effect on the employee and put an extra burden on their shoulders. So therefore, they have received 60% stimulus package. And also that we received orders from the custodian of Tulehimos, and the committee is under the supervision of the Crown Prince Mohammed Salman to provide the appropriate finance. And we at the Ministry of Finance, we have received our orders from the Crown Prince to provide the citizens with all the necessary health care needs. We have contracted to ensure the purchase all the necessary health equipment, because we know that there a great demand on different health supplies. The kingdom has made sure that all the citizens receive all they need to stay protected, and also the royal decree from the custodians of the two Hadimosh to ensure that all the private sector payments should be paid for by those initiatives. And we have been able to do so in a period that was less than 30 days. We have paid more than 200 billion Saudi riyals for the private sector, and the Ministry of Finance have paid all the payments necessary for the private sector during a period that is less than 30 days. Almost 87% of those payments due of the private sector was paid for by the government. Those initiatives still continue, as we see on the screen, there are a number of initiatives that include great support for SMEs. As we know that the small and medium enterprises, it's a great role that play in employing citizens, as its owners also are citizens. And instead of looking for a different job, we have provided those initiatives to help an economical growth and continue employing our citizens. We are very keen to support those SMEs, and we continue to study what is needed by the private sector, including the SMEs, to ensure that they receive the proper support. The support was on different phases and levels. And in the first phase, we didn't have enough time to have a detailed study of who is targeted and who is impacted greatly by this epidemic. So therefore, we have seen that it would be fit to have all those initiatives to be inclusive, and we took our time. We'll take our time in the first 3 months to see the most effective sectors that needed the most support, and to extend the support and to launch different initiatives as needed, whether in regard to relief of some of the payments or any financial payments due, or most of it has been delayed for 3 months, and now we are considering the delay of those payments due to 6 months by refocusing on those initiatives, whether according to the different sectors and based on the most affected sectors. And the higher coordination committee headed by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, and continuing its work to review all those initiatives that has been launched and to ensure that it's effective and fulfill its duties as needed. A committee has been formed with the National Development Fund, with the number of ministers participating in this process to look into those funds needs to provide support for the different entities within the private sector, whether SMEs or the agricultural sector. Uh, More than 14 million riyals was provided for those funds to provide more support for the private sector, and this committee continues to provide support. In front of you on the screen, you can see a number of initiatives and its chronological order, and you can see the response of the government was very rapid, and the reviews and the studies took a very short period of time, and the resolution and decisions are given also in a very short period of time. I cannot really talk enough about the great response by the Crown Prince, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince at the Custodian of Tualamus, to after the recommendations received by the committee. I believe as ministers we all agreed that to His Royal Highness the Custodian of Tualamus and the Crown Prince as for the support for the private sector and the citizens working with different sectors of the economy. This committee will continue its duties to study any additional procedures. We have a number of meetings that will see a number of different initiatives, whether in the transportation sector, specifically in the tourism sector, as it was the most affected, and the hotel and hospitality industry, and many other industrial sectors. And during the past few days, there were a number of decisions, uh, uh, such as lowering the electrical bill for the industrial and the commercial sector to support those two sectors, and will continue to announce any other initiatives and support. And the committee will continue its meetings as needed. As I mentioned at the beginning, this epidemic is not only in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's a global epidemic, as we know, and the whole world is trying to understand where are we headed, what are the health impacts, what are the precautionary measures that should be undertaken, and what are the results of those measures on the economy, and as we view this with the rest of the world. And this year, the kingdom, as it was leading the G20, it's honored to do so. The leaders of the kingdom, the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, has led a number of great global efforts to ensure the world that we are capable of leading a very effective response in the coming G20. The custodian of two Holiness have called for an exceptional summit, virtual exceptional summit, through the blogosphere, in which there were very decisive decisions were taken by the different countries of G20, providing for more than $5 trillion to the global economy. And from that time on, that amount had reached $7 trillion. In the kingdom, we continue to be committed based on the leaders, what has been mentioned by the leaders of the G20. The leaders have been keen to provide support for the poor and developed countries, and all those initiatives that had been passed to the ministries of health, the ministries of finance, to support the poor countries. The ministers of finance of the G20 have had many meetings during the past 6 weeks. We have met 4 times, and in those meetings, there were decisive decisions. In the past week, decisions. One of it was to have a clear action plan of action to support the poorest countries. Also, another historical initiative to stop paying the different payments of the those countries, the loan payments for those countries. We have saved them tens of millions of dollars, so they can use those funds to respond to this epidemic, whether in the health sector or the economical sector. And the kingdom also has called for, and specifically custodian of Tualamus have given a royal decree to support the G20 countries and the global community and the private sector and the civic society institutions to link the gap of finance for the health institutions. Some of the global health institutions need close to $8 billion to support the research to come up with a vaccine for this epidemic, and for different another research as we need. As the world is needing a vaccine to face this epidemic, and we recommendation of the Crown Prince have provided $500 million. This is a new initiative, and we are confident that during the coming few weeks, the $8 billion amount will be available, and with the help of Allah, as we are working with the global institution to reach or to find a vaccine rather for this epidemic. We continue in this path. The kingdom also have launched a number of different initiatives, whether for Yemen, as we have donated $500 million for the humanitarian aid in Yemen, and 25 million specifically as an additional amount to organize the efforts to combat this epidemic in Yemen. The kingdom has provided different amounts of subsidies for the World Health Organization, and we'll continue in those efforts and initiatives. Also working with the G20, and as we are leading the G20 to deal with the economical effects on the global level, to ensure that the chains of supply for the food supply and the health and different types of subsidies are available. And as has been mentioned in the exceptional meeting of the G20, to continue and ensure that we have clear plans to get the economy back on track and to heal from the impact of this epidemic on the economical. We are working with the IMF and the World Bank, and we are also coordinating with the GCC. The ministers of GCC have met yesterday to coordinate efforts to combat this epidemic. Those efforts must be coordinated, and countries cannot open back its economy if others don't do so, because many countries rely on the supply chains between those countries, and to open the borders for it, their citizens will continue by the praise of Allah in this path. And finally, I would like to talk about the return of economy and the governance of the government plan to reopen the economy and the economical activities. Of course, this is the biggest has the state committed as far as the guidelines and instructions of the government of the custody of the two Alamos to stay at home to ensure that we are controlling this epidemic. This commitment also have positive economical impacts, and it's of great importance that the government is responding. The government has been working for weeks not only to combat this epidemic but also to treat the infected individuals and all the also the positive effects. How can we get back on track as far as the economy? There are many committees. Committees are working now to ensure that the plan that's working on a number of paths. The first path is the health sector path, what can we do to ensure that the economical activity not affecting the health sector. The second point is to do this gradually. This work must be gradual. We might reopen some of the business activities and might close again if some of the health measures requires to do so, and it must be understood by the private sector that any activities or initiatives set by the government to reopen the economy, we might see some of those activities close again. So we are coordinating with a number of countries now that are working to set plans to reopen their economies to ensure that this work is coordinated, and then after that the appropriate authorities will be given enough time to evaluate the gradual return of business to those sectors and to ensure that the private sector and the health sector they're both working with great compatibility to set the proper precautionary measures. Of course, this work needs continuous planning in all chains of supply. If you wanted to reopen a certain business, you must ensure that the other work relating to that certain activity must also be reopened. I don't want to get into details, but I will give some examples about some of the sectors. And if we allow for some of the activities or the industrial activities or the construction sector, even if we reopen those factories, we must ensure that the clients of those factories are allowed to do business. If we start to work on the retail and the wholesale sector, we must ensure that both the wholesale and retail are reopened, or the activities are reopened, and therefore the whole chain must be closely monitored, and also the health specialist must look into this matter as far as there are no dangers to the citizens. And we will continue in this path, and the government will announce about this plan in regards to reopen those activities whenever it's possible, or the greatest concern, as I said before, for the government of the custodian to almost is the health of the citizen and the expatriate, and to control this virus and to reopen our economies and our economical activities again. Thank you, Mr. Minister. There are a number of questions from different media agencies. The first question is two parts from Bloomberg. Are the government is going to take any other procedures to reopen the economy? I cannot hear properly. I cannot hear the speaker properly. Thank you. Of course, the government had announced for the past few weeks about their procedures to redistribute the government expenditure to ensure that the expenditure is during this crisis is to the most important expenditures of the government, to the benefit of the citizen and to the benefit of the health sector that needs support from all of us. We currently are looking at any additional procedures. Of course, there are government expenditures that will be delayed because of some of the precautionary measures that are currently in place, and therefore the travel expenses and so forth. In addition to the events expenditures, tourism, entertainment sector, the sports sector, and there are some other activities, some of the projects that have been halted now. Of course, there will be delay as far as the expenditures, so therefore there will be savings due to those measures. Now we are working in the different centers that are doing the proper studies to lower the government expenditure, as we know that the Saudi economy is facing a number of challenges currently. The first challenge is the epidemic of corona and its impact, and then also the lowered revenues because of the epidemic. and therefore, if there are no economical activities, the revenues or the government revenues will be the non-oil government revenues will be lowered. There are also some types of other government revenues from the oil sector, as we are dealing with, to ensure that our expenditure is dealing with those challenges, and also at the same time the government is committed to provide all the resources to protect the citizen, to protect the health sector, to ensure that the health sector have the necessary equipment and the necessary funding to combat this epidemic. We are ensuring that the uh, society protection matrix uh, is as planned for, and the government have a clear commitment to provide support for the economy, provide support for the private sector, especially as for the as mentioned before. We want our citizens to maintain their employment, and will continue to do so. The second question from Riyadh, from Hazm. How those initiatives will be affecting the epidemic of corona. I'm sorry, I cannot hear the speaker properly. I cannot hear the speaker properly. Thank you. And as I said before, the coordinating committee headed by His Royal Highness the Crown Prince have set a number of standards to provide the support and the procedures undertaken by the government to limit the uh, impact of this epidemic on the economy. And some of those standards, as I mentioned before, are the most affected sectors, the establishment, the employee. So these the most. So we have taken very rapid measures, as I mentioned before, the Standard Initiative, to provide subsidies for the salaries of the citizens in the private sectors. Also working with the different monetary agencies to delay some the payments and the loan payments, and therefore their income would not be impacted during this crisis, to ensure that the establishment of the private sector can receive funding for the working capital to continue during this crisis. We have made sure that extra funding will be available for different government funds, as providing for the working families, providing for the citizens. There are thousands of establishments, hundreds of thousands of SMEs and citizens that benefit from the Social Development Bank, or the Human Resources Fund, or from the Agricultural Fund, or the Industrial Fund, or the Real Estate Fund. The funding will be available for them. Some of the payments have been delayed, so we have ensured that they have enough liquidity to use it to continue business and to deal with this crisis. Of course, we will continue to study what can be achieved during the next few months, to study whether those precaution measures will continue and its impact, and what the government can provide for the private sector and for the citizens in this regard. There are a number of procedure that is currently being studied by the task force, as and I received a question as I was entering into this conference, and about the rentals, the government rentals for the private sector, the government properties that is being rented by the private sector, whether the government will delay or even not receive any payments for those for the rent by those private entities or SMEs. This surely will all try to help each other in this crisis, and we are hoping that the business owners and entrepreneurs and the citizens have shown great respect and responsibility, that's showing the true image of the Saudi citizen during crisis. Minister, Your Excellency, the Minister, I cannot hear the speaker properly. Cannot hear the speaker properly. What are the expectations for the GDP and the non-oil GDP? Thank you for your question. And in general, the as we have seen in different reports by international agencies, that by the end of 2019, the IMF have seen that are about 170 countries, and the kingdom will see a positive growth in their economies. And its last report by the IMF that was announced last week, they see that about 180 countries will see a reduction or a decline, a negative decline in their GDP. About 180 countries. The kingdom is not an exception, and we have two parts that we will speak about. The first is about the lowering the oil exports that will have an effect on GDP. So therefore, the GDP will be lowered due to lowered oil prices, but also the non-oil GDP will also be will decrease. And for the first time in the history of for the non-oil GDP, we expect that it will be negative this year, and this is not strange due to the current measures. As I said before, our first goal and priority to ensure the safety and the health of our citizens. We'll continue to study those issues, and I will study the initiatives that will give the most support to different sectors. Of course, there will be an impact on the GDP for this year, as we all know. Thank you, Your Excellency. The question: during the past year and the beginning of this, I cannot hear the speaker properly. Thank you, Mr. Ali. As I mentioned before, the government, the government for years has stayed committed to pay all the amenities of the private sector, and the Ministry of Finance announced on periodic basis every 3 months about paying and ensuring the paying the amenities of the private sector. The 2019 we have paid more than 200 billion reals for the private sector. 98% was within 15 days, not even 60 days, and the rest was paid within the 60 days period. In the first quarter of this year, till the end of the past month, we have paid more than 23 billion reals for the private sector. 87% of it was paid within 30 days from the Ministry of Finance. Will continue to do so. In addition to it, has been ordered by the custodian to allow us to ensure the private sector are paid for all their payments due, and we're working with different government entities. As we are working remotely, we have provided different mechanisms to work remotely to ensure that all the private sector needs are provided, and this will end by accelerating the process of paying all the amenities of the private sector. A question from Reuters: what is the amount that is expected from the... I cannot hear the speaker properly. Thank you, Sister Marwa. The government have, praise to Allah, have the proper financial cover to combat this crisis because of all the reforms that were undertaken in the past years. The government has been able to control the deficit to a great extent. We have a reserve that will ensure that we will cover our deficits. We do not expect that we will use any of our savings, not more than 10%, will not exceed 20 million reals, and this is what has been planned for in the budget. As I have announced a few weeks ago, We will increase the borrowing from the local and the international market, and as we have seen in the past few days, a very great success for our second edition for the debt tools in the market. We have seen a great demand. We have seen Standard and Poor's and different other agencies ensure the financial classification of the kingdom with the so therefore the investors are assured about the ability of the kingdom to borrow, and we are continuing to launch more of those debt tools to cover the deficit in the budget. Thank you. The second question from what are the implications and the benefits that the Ministry of Finance has an impact on the private sector? I cannot hear the speaker properly. Thank you, Mr. Ali. And if liquidity is available in the private sector, we can continue to uh, stay to continue in business during this crisis. The government is very clear. The instructions of the custodian of autonomous are very clear. Of the crown prince, the instructions are very clear to ensure that the receivables of the private sector are paid for. The citizens have the proper funds to continue their life, and at the Ministry of Finance will continue to follow the instructions of the custodian to Holy Mosque, and we are sure that the private sector will benefit from it as far as the working capital and paying all its debt or to ensure the other receivables are paid for. You cannot hear the speaker properly. Thank you, Sister Nasreen. And the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have a clear strategy to manage the national debt. We have a center that managing the national debt. They keep in contact with the investors as far as the debt tools that are issued by the government. So we have increased the debt tools this year. We might reach 100 billion riyals in addition to the 120 billion that has been announced before. So the number of bonds and different debt tools issued by the government might reach 220 billion riyals. In addition to withdrawing from our savings, according to the our schedule as has been announced in the budget, with the participation of the private sector, we have huge projects that has seen its impact in 2019 when the private sector financed a number of capital projects with tens of millions of dollars instead of being financed from our national budget. It has been financed by the private sector, and as we have spoken a few minutes ago about the aspects that we can lower our expenditures, and of course the different sectors that needed funded and other expenditures that can be delayed, which is not of great need immediately. There are some project that has been taken by some of the contracts, but to be, you cannot hear the speaker properly. Is there a mechanism to pay for the entitlements of those contractors? I cannot hear the speaker properly. Thank you, Mr. Fayad, and I think that's a very important question. First, I fully understand the impacts pertaining from the precautionary measures, but the government have invested greatly in the infrastructure sector, or the electronic infrastructure rather, and we have an ability in the government to manage the government projects remotely. And in the Ministry of Finance, we have approved that clearly, and I believe a number of government entities have approved that. So also, and the work did continue during this crisis as planned for. But specifically, in answer to that question, now we have a task force that's working in the Ministry of Finance, dealing with different government entities to ensure that the entitlements of the private sector is paid for, all the bills that we receive and the what we receive from the private sectors. We have the Etimad electronic portal to ensure that everybody will apply through that portal and submit their bills to the that test for to be reviewed by the proper government entity. And we have launched also we have passed a resolution to the different government entities to accept all the electronic billing processes, whether um, it's coming from suppliers or contractors. And there are a number of challenges different government entities to review those electronic filings, and there could be partial payments while they review the rest of the private sector entitlements. Our great concern again is the health of the private sector and those who's working in the crime sector to continue employment. Yes, we understand that the needs of the private sector. They are the ones employing the private sector. The government of the custodian to most and the instructions of the Crown Prince is clear. We must stand by the private sector. We have been standing by them and will continue to do so. I personally and their excellence the ministers are in continuous communication with the private sector through the Chamber of Commerce and different entities to listen to their concerns and to accelerate any subsidies to ensure their support for the private sector. Question from Arab News regarding the support for the affected businesses in the private sector. When will they receive that support? Thank you, Faisal. And sure, the crisis is a global one, and it's new to all of us. We haven't seen such a crisis before, um, probably during the past 100 years. So the different houses of expertise, if you may, and the different government entities locally and abroad are dealing with a situation that has never been dealt before, whether in the health sector or in the economy and financial sectors. So now we are greatly benefiting from the information that we receive from the health sector and the pandemic experts to ensure that the estimates and to put different scenarios for the duration of this crisis. And we expect the continuity of this crisis for a number of months. It might extend to the end of the year. As far as the health sector, and also would have an impact on the economy. The measures that we have spoken about are temporary precautionary measures, and we have decided that we'll continue for the next 3 months to provide rapid support for the private sector while we study in details what is needed to be done by us as government to support the economy, and especially again, I'll say it one more time, the SMEs and the citizens who are working on those sectors will continue in that path, and we will announce before the end of the 3 months period from this crisis. So that will be before the end of June. What, as far as extending some of the measures or the initiatives, or change it, or even add in additional measures if there's a need to take more steps in this regard. Thank you, Your Excellency. There are a number of questions. Will there be an effect for the first quarter budget? And if there's an effect, how would that affect the revenues? The revenues for the first quarter will be announced within a few days. We haven't seen big surprises in the first quarter, praise to Allah, and the total revenues will be as expected in the budget, and that's is due to the most of the revenues in the first quarter, revenues that are rounded from the last quarter of the past year, whether it was oil or non-oil revenues. So the impact in the first quarter will be very limited, praise to Allah, whether in the oil or non-oil revenues. Thank you, Your Excellency, the Minister. From Sub newspaper, we know that there will be a great impact on SMEs. Do you see that the current initiatives are enough to support SMEs? Of course, Brother Abdullah, the impact on different economical sectors is huge, and specifically for SMEs. SMEs, the effect on those SMEs are more demanding because the ability to absorb the shock is less. Their cash flows are limited, and their ability to deal with such crises is very limited. So, if they want to deal with this crisis, it will be for a short period of time. We understand that fully. So the government and the High Coordination Committee are very keen to and very supportive of SMEs. There are a number of initiatives and surplus and stimulus packages for those SMEs. It has, as announced by the government, and also there was a directive to form a ministerial committee, and include a number of ministers, include the Minister of Trade and the Minister of Industry, and the director of the National Development Fund, to ensure that we launch any additional initiatives as needed by SMEs to provide support for them. We have met with them. We have talked about many initiatives. Some of it has been discussed now as we speak. We want to ensure that SMEs, and especially the businesses that provide employment for our citizens, to ensure its continuity to do business, and of course that they were mostly affected by this crisis. Last question from Al-Ikhbariya. The IMF is highly speaking of the financial cover. I cannot hear the speaker properly. I cannot hear the speaker properly. Thank you, Brother Abdul Majid. And of course, praise to Allah, the kingdom enjoys a very good economical status. The kingdom is the biggest economy in the region. The kingdom have savings and reserves of hard currencies that makes it rank third in the world. We have been reviewing our performance by different financial classification agencies, and they know the impact of those financial shocks, and they know that the credit classification of the kingdom has been studied. So the kingdom has been able to provide the support for the health sector, providing support also for the private sector, especially SMEs. And we will deal with this crisis, and we will overcome it stronger with the coordination and of the government and private sector and citizens. The kingdom had gone through and dealt with many crises in its history, and it had been able to overcome it. We have engaged in wars in the past 20, 30 years, and we were able to overcome those obstacles. The government have undertaken a number of steps through the vision of 2030, in which we were able to diversify the economy. The journey still continues. and now we started the trying to control the deficit to ensure the competency of the or the efficiency rather of the government expenditure. But at the end of the day, the resources at the hands of any government still limited, and the government must work to use those resources to have the best possible return and the best impact, and of course the direct impact to provide the needs of the citizens, whether it's in the light of this crisis. Thank you, Mister. I cannot see the speaker properly. Cannot hear the speaker properly.